So our next speaker is Dan Hummer. Dan received his bachelor's degree from Iowa State and his PhD from Penn State. Dan is a mineralogist and a geochemist. After completing his postdoc at Carnegie, then UCLA, then back at Carnegie, he started an assistant professor position at Southern Illinois University. Today, he's going to give us a talk on mineral evolution and Earth's geochemical history. Take it away, Dan.
All right, thanks very much, Nathan. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Before I get into the talk, I want to sincerely thank Paul and the other organizers for inviting me to be here today. This has been really fun. I learned a lot about proteins yesterday. Okay, it's very much outside of my world, my normal world. And I really enjoyed the talks today as well. So it's really been a pleasure to be a part of this. I also want to thank Beatrice for organizing everything and taking care of logistics and all of that. She's done a great job. And most importantly, I want to thank you all for giving me an excuse after 2 very long, frustrating years of being able to finally come out and wear my periodic table tie, which I've not had an opportunity to wear since this all started. So thank you. So I am going to be talking today about several related projects that I'm involved with, trying to use really large data sets of mineral occurrences around the world to try to trace back things about geochemical history on Earth, and specifically for this crowd, how they might relate to the origins and evolution of life. Some of you might know, I did my most recent postdoc before I came to SIU was with Bob Hazen, and we were working on these kinds of things. And so many of the things that I'll show you are things that I did with him and that have led to other things that were an outgrowth of that work. I also want to stop for a moment before I get into the meat of it to thank all of the collaborators that I've worked with. These are just a few of them. I've worked with lots and lots of collaborators because, as it says up there, when you have lots and lots of data, you need lots and lots of collaborators to help you make sense of it. And each of these people, plus numerous others, have lended their own unique skills and expertise to developing these data sets and to interpreting them. And a few that I'll just briefly mention here. Shauna and Anna Rude, who you've already heard from, I've been working with for several years now, and they are really experts at making these network diagrams and getting information from it. We work with Greta Heisted at Indiana University, who is a mathematician who develops a lot of the mathematical models that we use. Bob Hazen, of course, who I've been working with for quite a while. And these 2 down here are actually current graduate students of mine, Jessica Cruzan and Catherine Uranek. And towards the end, I'll mention a little bit about what they're doing. And hopefully some of you will, might even be able to help in what they are doing. And lastly, I want to acknowledge our good friend Peter Fox, who we tragically lost last year. He was a data scientist at RPI, and he developed a lot of the techniques that we are now using to do this work. So we all very much miss him. This work, by the way, has been funded by a combination of the Keck Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, NSF, and NASA through a few different programs. So we're very grateful for all of that support. Okay, so today my goal is to convince you of a couple of things. And the most important here is that we can't view the geosphere, and I think we've seen a lot of hints of this in previous talks, but we can't view the geosphere and biosphere as just separate entities that are sitting around doing their own thing. They are very, very intertwined with each other. So if we want to understand the origin and evolution of life, I think we have to understand, number one, as we saw a lot of yesterday, the origins, functions, and evolutions of biological molecules. But number two, and perhaps equally important, we also have to understand the mineralogical and geochemical environment in which these molecules actually arose and evolved. And that, of course, is the focus of my work. But I think both are crucial pieces of the puzzle because we'll see numerous examples where these two things are not acting independently. They're very much intertwined with each other in ways that we're only beginning to understand. So here is just a snapshot of the web page from which we get a lot of the data that we use. Okay, so all of the data, the databases that I'm going to be showing you today are all publicly available. Okay, so all of you can access this data. All of you can be mineral masters. And it's all here on this website, rough.info. And what we have is a database of all of the known mineral species, which are listed alphabetically right here. There are well over 5,500. They're actually close to 6,000 now, because a few dozen new mineral species, believe it or not, are discovered every year. We also have this very handy searchable chemistry filter, a periodic table down here, where you can say, well, I want to know about the minerals with carbon. And so you simply click that and click search, and it shows you all of the mineral species that involve carbon. And crucially, for the science that we're really interested in, we have this feature up here, the mineral evolution button, that contains a database of geologic ages. Okay, so whenever literature comes out that seems to reliably date a geologic feature or a set of minerals to a particular age, that goes into this database. And there are people at University of Arizona working with Bob Downs, who are responsible for including that in the database. So that's a little bit about where we get our data from. Another crucial place where we get our data is from mindat.org. It's not so important for the ages, but it's very important for the locations of the minerals. And that was founded and is headed up by our collaborator, Julian Ralph, who is in the UK. And if you go to Mindat, but I heard it mentioned actually at this very conference, so I think some of you are familiar with Mindat, but it's a wonderful resource. If you go to Mindat, you can click on a mineral and find out all kinds of great data about that mineral. And it will also give you a list of all the locations where it occurs, and you can do it vice versa. It has a database of localities, and you can click on a locality such as this Copper King mine in Colorado, and it will list for you alphabetically all of the minerals that are documented from that locality, and you can even search them by chemistry. Okay, so it's a really, really useful, just casual database to use as you're working on your research, but also really useful for these large studies. Okay, so before we dive into relationships between minerals and what we're doing with them, since this is a very interdisciplinary audience, I thought we would take a step back for a moment and actually define what a mineral is. And I was asked a couple of good questions about what a mineral is during yesterday's lunch, actually. So what do we mean when we say, for example, a mineral species? Okay, well, probably many of you know what a biological species is. What's a mineral species? There's a lot of variety with these things. Well, what we mean is a solid, naturally occurring crystalline substance. There was formerly a stipulation that it be inorganic, but we're kind of relaxing that over time as we learn that more and more organic things really do crystallize in nature. And so it has to meet these criteria, and it has to have a unique combination, specifically of chemical composition and atomic structure. Okay, so for a classic example, probably all of you are familiar with, is we have the materials graphite, which is pure carbon, and the material diamond, which is also pure carbon, but we consider them separate mineral species because they have very different atomic structures that impart them with totally different physical properties. Okay, so that is specifically what we mean by mineral species. And we have about, as best we know, 6,000 of those on the planet. Okay, well, so about a decade or so ago, Bob Hazen was talking with a biologist. I don't remember what biologist it was, actually. Maybe he can tell us. But he came up with this idea to use a trick that you biologists have actually been using for a while to study the statistics of populations. And so we wanted to know, how are minerals distributed on Earth? So we developed these databases, and we have, as of February 2014, I guess I haven't updated this slide in a while, clearly. This number is probably larger now. But we have, over 5,000 mineral species now. We have hundreds of thousands of localities, many hundreds of thousands of unique combinations of mineral species and a locality. So in other words, a mineral locality pair, a particular mineral occurring at a particular locality. And so we've done a lot of work with this big data set and quantifying how many minerals are out there and how many we think remain undiscovered. And this has been the topic of a few papers. Here is a couple of them. You'll notice our mathematician, Greta Heisted, is a first author on many of these papers. And the incredible thing that we find is that the distribution of these 6,000 known mineral species conforms to exactly the same kind of distribution as words in a book. Or incidentally, biomass in an ecosystem, for those of you that do kind of environmental biology. So it's a very weird connection. Like, why would minerals follow the same pattern as these other things? But when we look at the data, they in fact do. So to kind of illustrate this, think about opening a random page in a book and just picking out a random word. Saying, what word is it going to be? Well, we don't know. It could be thousands of different words. But you're really, really likely to land on a word like a, and, the, is, are. Okay, those are extremely common words in the English language. And maybe even more often than not, you are going to run into one of those. Okay, and it's the rare words, it's the words that we don't see very often that are actually signatures for the topic that you're talking about. Or linguists have discovered even the authorship. You can identify the author of an unsigned manuscript just by the combinations of rare words that they're using, okay? And you can even predict an author's total vocabulary statistically just by looking at what kinds of words that they use. And we can do the same kind of trick with these mineral data sets, as it turns out. As I mentioned, this is work that has largely been spearheaded by Greta. So if we plot the frequencies of mineral occurrences, and so here on the y-axis, we have the number of minerals that are found at a particular number of localities, and we have the number of localities on the x-axis. So in other words, what this means is over 1,000 different mineral species are found at only one location on Earth. Think about that for a moment. That's kind of amazing. Okay, out of 6,000 species, like 16 to 20% of them are unique to one location and one location only, as best we currently know. And then from there, the distribution tails off. There's about 600 that are only known from 2 localities and so forth until we get to minerals that are from many, many localities. There are only a handful of minerals that we know. And this statistical distribution happens to be known as a large number of rare events, or an LNRE type distribution. And we can take these data sets and we can fit them to the LNRE distribution very, very effectively. And we consistently see that all of the minerals and even subsets of the mineral kingdom conform to this distribution. Okay, so once you have all of that data, you can do fun things like predict, well, how many minerals are there actually on Earth? We know about 6,000. That doesn't necessarily mean there are 6,000. There's surely ones that we don't know about, hiding in the crevices of rock somewhere. Well, there certainly are, but we can quantitatively predict how many of them are undiscovered by using the statistics on these accumulation curves. So to orient you here, on the x-axis, I've got number of mineral counts, number of mineral observations. So in other words, I go to some location on Earth and I see a particular mineral and I say, aha, that's one mineral. Okay, that's one tick on the x-axis right there. Then I come over here and I see another mineral and say, oh, here's another mineral, another tick on the x-axis. And as I do that on the y-axis, I plot the total number of unique species that we know about. So obviously, when you begin this process, you discover minerals very rapidly. Okay, so I'm going to begin my mineral locality data collection. And after a few observations, I've accumulated lots and lots of mineral species, because in the beginning, you're very often finding new things that you haven't seen before. But as that process continues, it tapers off at some point. Okay, so for example, at this point, a few years back, we had 4,831 minerals. Okay, but now we have even more. And if you extrapolate this curve out into the future, it will asymptote at a particular value, and the mathematical distribution tells us exactly what that value is. Okay, so from this projection, we would predict about 6,400 total minerals. But in fact, we have updated these methods, and we've included Bayesian analysis, which was spoken about by Mike Wong. And if we include a Bayesian analysis, that actually ups it to about 9,300 total mineral species that we have on the planet, nearly 10,000. That's a really incredible variety. Okay, so these minerals are a very information-rich system that we can learn a great deal from. Okay, and of course, this quantitatively predicts that there are 4,800 new mineral species out there that are yet to be discovered. That's a really fun thought. I hope to discover a couple of them. We'll see if that happens at some point in my career. So once we have all of this data, we can do things like graph out how the minerals are related to each other. What localities do they tend to occur? Which minerals tend to occur with each other and which do not? And so we have been making lots of mineral network diagrams, and I'm not going to go into much detail about this because my colleagues Shauna and Anna Rude have already done a great job of talking about that. Mike Wong also talked about it. And so we can put together diagrams where each node represents a mineral species, and then the connections represent that those two mineral species co-occur at a particular locality on Earth. And the closer they are to each other, the more locations they occur together, and the further apart, the less often they occur. So we can build big networks like this. Here's an example of one of these networks that, like I said, this is the only one I'll show you because other speakers have shown you more details on these networks. But we can build, for example, this is a mineral network of just common minerals in igneous rocks, is all it is. Okay, so when magma crystallizes, here's the set of minerals that are typically formed. And if you think about the common rock types on Earth, every one of those rock types is represented somewhere on this diagram. So it's really interesting to think all igneous rocks, all of igneous petrology is somewhere on this diagram, and we can get both qualitative and quantitative information about how common different rock types are and how often they include certain minerals just by looking at the diagram. So for example, here, granite and syenite include these particular sets of minerals, and there's some overlap. So that tells us that those rocks are probably genetically related to each other, whereas a basalt contains a set of minerals that does not overlap, so it's a little further removed in its environment of formation. Okay, so this information gives us an awful lot of data to play with in the form of those network metrics that Anna Rude and Shauna and Mike have been talking about. Okay, so if we can do this with the way that minerals get together and form rocks, we can also actually do similar kinds of analyses with the way that the constituent elements themselves get together and form minerals. So I have been working on that recently. And before I go any further, I want to comment, because this is really a cornerstone of geochemistry. So for those of you that aren't familiar with geochemistry, you should know about this classification scheme that we have. Right now, it's just a qualitative classification scheme. But it was invented by this Norwegian geochemist, Victor Goldschmidt, nearly 100 years ago now. Yeah, just shy of 100 years ago. And what he noticed is that elements tend to occur in the natural environment in particular forms. They tend to be associated with particular other elements. And so here is his classification scheme. And in this color-coded scheme here, we have a few fundamentally different types of elements. We have lithophile elements, which are ones that just commonly form with normal, regular old run-of-the-mill rock-forming silicate minerals. Or an element can prefer to be in the metallic state. If it tends to reside in metallic phases, then we call it siderophile. And if an element tends to occur as sulfides, if it tends to occur, things like sulfides and arsenides, then we refer to it as chalcophile. And on the other hand, if it's volatile enough that it tends to just stay mostly in the oceans or atmosphere rather than remaining in solid phases, then we refer to it as atmophile. Okay, so with that in mind, we can actually look now quantitatively at how elements are getting together to form minerals, because we have a database of 6,000 of them. We know all of their nominal chemical formulas. That gives us an enormous amount of data to play with. So what we can do is ask ourselves simple questions like, well, if I pick any two pair of elements on the periodic table, how often do they occur together in nature? Or I should specify, I guess, in minerals, to be fair, but minerals, you know, is a big subset of the Earth. How often, for example, do silver and sulfur occur together? And we can look at that. We have the data to answer that question, and we can also compare it to how often they would occur together, you know, if things were just arranged randomly. So I'll show you an example of that, and it actually leads to a lot of powerful information. Okay, so we use this database, the rough database, at all of the occurrences and records of these minerals and their chemical compositions to figure out how often elements get together. So what you can do, I'll illustrate this kind of by way of just one example, but of course with computers we can, you know, do it in a matter of minutes with the entire periodic table. But just to give you a quick example, suppose that I look at the co-occurrence of silver, which is along the top here, and sulfur, which is along the rows. How often do they occur together? Well, I can make a couple of different tables to represent this to us. We can make a table that is just a theoretical one of how much we would expect them to occur together based on their natural abundance. Okay, so in other words, we have, if you look along the columns here, there are 177 minerals that contain silver, and the remainder of them, these 4,800, do not have silver for a total of this many minerals. That's how many actual chemical records we had in the database at that time. So from that proportion and the proportion of ones that contain sulfur, you can extrapolate and say, well, if this proportion of minerals have silver and this proportion have sulfur, you know, just multiply those probabilities, right? And you should get, by random chance, how often they should occur together. And that number is shown in green right here. We would expect, just based on dumb luck, just based on random chance, that silver and sulfur get together to form minerals, should form 37 mineral species. But of course, chemistry is not chance. You know, chemistry follows certain rules. And so if we look at the actual numbers down here, oh, whoops, I forgot to click on those. So there's the 37 representing our prediction. And down here's the table representing the actual numbers. This is the actual count from the database. And what we find is that silver and sulfur co-occur in minerals about 3 times as often as what we would expect by chance. So that gives us an indication that silver and sulfur like each other. They're very much tied to each other, and they tend to occur together in minerals more often than we would expect, by chance that is. So you can do this with the whole periodic table here. I'm showing just a little slice of the periodic table, but in this correlation matrix, you can see all of the ways that the elements are correlated with each other. And in this table, by the way, what I'm actually plotting, these numbers, are the negative logarithm of the p-value that we get from a chi-squared test. You can do a chi-squared distribution analysis and find out what the chances are of those two elements occurring together in the way that they do. And in the green colors, we have everything that's positively correlated, and in the red colors, we have anti-correlations. And you know, if you're familiar with geochemistry, you start to see some really exciting and fascinating patterns on this diagram. So for example, if you look at the oxygen column here, this oxygen column contains a numbered record of its correlations with all of these other elements. So we can take that p-value, you know, take the negative log of it anyway, is what we're showing here. And that is sort of a measure of an element's affinity for oxygen in the natural world. Since every normal rock forming mineral tends to contain oxygen, we could also think of it as a measure of lithophilicity. Okay, over here we see silicon. Okay, the silicates also form a very large group of important minerals. So this value, the values that we see in this column, we could also think of as a measure of lithophilicity. Okay, a little bit different way of going about it, but never. And notice that these patterns of correlations and anti-correlations tend to be pretty similar between the oxygen column and the silicon column. Whereas if we move over a little bit and we go to sulfur, remember sulfur affinity is thought of as chalcophilicity in the geochemical world, then we see a very different pattern of correlations and anti-correlations. Okay, elements that tend to correlate well in green here, like at the beginning of the periodic table, oxygen, fluorine, sodium, magnesium, all of these sorts of elements correlate well with oxygen and silicon. They tend to be anti-correlated with sulfur. Okay, and so this column is something of a measure of chalcophilicity of an element. So up here, we have elements that correlate with oxygen and silicon, not with sulfur. So these are the lithophile elements. And down here, when we get to things like iron, nickel, copper, zinc, those are things that are anti-correlated with oxygen and silicon, but pretty well correlated with sulfur. So those are our chalcophile elements. So all of a sudden, based on this simple pulling out of this data of the way that the elements are arranged into minerals, suddenly we have a very potentially useful quantitative scale of lithophilicity and chalcophilicity that we can use to predict the behaviors of all kinds of things. And here's a plot actually of some of these measures plotted against each other. On the y-axis there is our measure of chalcophilicity, and on the x-axis is our lithophilicity, but we have to remember we could use silicon or oxygen to do that, so that's shown in different data points here. And what we find is that those measures of chalcophilicity and lithophilicity are strongly anti-correlated with each other, like we would expect them to be. Okay, the elements that tend to prefer oxygen and silicon do not prefer sulfur, and vice versa. So we can plot out those measures, and as it turns out, the R-squared value for the silicon correlations is not that great, but we do much better when we look at the oxygen correlations. And you can see that those red data points are really lined up for a lot of the periodic table along this quantitative scale. And then we can start looking at particular elements and look at what their behavior is using this oxygen scale, since it tends to be a better measure. Okay, so things like silver, which we just went through the example of, that tend to strongly prefer sulfur, they are high on chalcophilicity, low on lithophilicity. Then we've got things like these other chalcophile elements in here. We go through some intermediate ones, and then out the other side, we have silicon, calcium, aluminum. All of those things are on the other side of the diagram. I believe that this guy all the way down here is oxygen itself. So surprise, surprise, oxygen wants to be with oxygen and silicon. So this scale is really useful for figuring out the way that the elements behave in nature, and it can be useful in other contexts as well, okay, such as what kinds of other molecules they might be willing to interact with. So I think this sort of quantitative Goldschmidt scale of an element's geochemical behavior is potentially a really useful thing that we can take advantage of in the future. If we plot it out on a periodic table, and this is kind of fun, you can do this quantitatively, and here the shades of red indicate the level of lithophilicity as measured by the p-values in that analysis, and the yellow indicates the level of chalcophilicity. If you take a look, a lot of the chalcophile elements are over here in the P block of the periodic table. That's where you tend to see a lot of the strongly yellow colors. So, and then the ones that are in green are the ones where the oxygen and sulfur correlations, were a little bit murky. They weren't really opposite of each other, or they didn't yield a p-value that was, below the threshold of 0.05. So those are colored in green. So if you take a look, for example, at this box that has a lot of the fairly strongly yellow colored elements, and you compare that to what Victor Goldschmidt came up with 100 years ago, remember, without having any of this data, it's really a spot-on match. It's very impressive. There are the elements that Goldschmidt himself said are chalcophile, and here are the ones that show up in the data set as being fairly strongly chalcophile. Another interesting thing that we can do, and this really gets to the heart of what all of us are interested in, and that is how have these things changed over time? Because new minerals are being developed with new geochemical and physical and biological processes throughout all of Earth's history. And we'd really like to understand what minerals and what kind of geochemical environment were present at different points in Earth's history. So here's an example of that. We can look at the way that elements got together to form minerals in a prebiotic world, like in the Hadean. And Bob Hazen actually wrote a paper expounding upon what minerals we should find in the Hadean. And we can compare that to how elements were getting together in minerals in the present day. And there are some striking differences. So for example, I've listed here in green and in red, the green arrows and the green list here represents the 4 strongest positive correlations between elements. And in the red are the 4 strongest anti-correlations. And if you look at where what is governing those correlations and anti-correlations, in the Hadean, it is largely about oxygen. Look how many arrows are coming in and out of oxygen right there. Okay, a lot of these correlations involve oxygen. So back in the Hadean, it was kind of simplistic. It really was about whether an element was going to get together with oxygen or probably sulfur was the alternative. So that lithophile and chalcophile behavior becomes very important. In the present day, the list looks very different. Nowadays, here are the strongest correlations, and the OH correlation is actually the biggest one. Now, it made, over here in the Hadean, it made the top 2, but that correlation actually goes up in minerals by orders of magnitude in the present day as compared to what it was in the Hadean. So actually quite a striking difference if you look at the numbers. Okay, so in the present day, it's more about the silicate minerals. It's more about which elements tend to go into silicates and which ones do not. Okay, and here's a really crucial thing. These data, these are patterns not just in one particular mineral that we think may have arisen from living things. These are the patterns that we see in all of mineralogy on the entire Earth. That's the data that we're looking at. And so, Mike Wong, if you're out there, we need you to tell the folks at NASA, not just networks of atmospheric molecules, which is very cool, but we also need to be looking at the way that minerals get together to form rocks and the way that elements get together to form minerals, because I think the striking differences, it's quite possible that these striking differences in correlation between Hadean and present day mineralogy very well could be a biosignature. Okay, any of these things could be potential biosignatures that have changed between the prebiotic world and the biotic world. Okay, so to kind of summarize that part of the talk, and then we'll do a little bit more. These element correlations through time in the Hadean world, mineralogy was very oxygen-centric, and it was dominated by primordial oxides and silicates, okay, that were cooling off from the magma ocean, essentially, that the Earth used to be. But in the present day world, it's more silicon-centric, and our minerals are dominated by a lot of hydrous minerals and a lot of very altered silicates. And that often includes hydrated species. Okay, so the abundance and combinations of those hydrous minerals where the fluid phases on the planet have potentially been very heavily influenced by life, I think is another possible biosignature. Okay, now for fun, I want to show you another cool result that we got by looking not just at pairs of elements, but also at triplets of elements. So we can ask, for example, how often do carbon and vanadium and mercury get together in minerals? I don't know. It's somewhere in our data set. I don't remember what the result is, but there's an example. How often do those 3 occur? We don't know. We can take a look. So we did that. We did that analysis with every possible triplet of minerals. So now you're talking about, there's 72 mineral forming elements. So now you're talking about 72 cubed different analyses that you have to run. But we can do this. We can apply this sort of style of chi-squared test called the Cochrane-Mantel-Hansel test that basically answers statistically the question, how does the presence of element Z affect the correlation between elements X and Y? Okay, so you're throwing a third variable in there and looking at its effect on the correlation of the other two. Okay, and so there is the equation that we use, and we know how to do this test. We can crank through it with computers, and then we can visualize it. And this is work that I've done with the help of Marshall Ma at the University of Idaho. And you can create a three-dimensional matrix showing these triplets of correlations. So there it is, and in this big matrix here that has an X, Y, and Z dimension, we've colored each element, each little voxel, either in red, which indicates an anti-correlation, or in blue, which represents a positive correlation. So there's all the mineral forming elements across each axis there. And then we've got correlations up here, and we've got anti-correlations down there. Now, at first glance, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot going on. Okay, there's a lot of green just in the middle. Okay, so not a lot going on so far with the triplets. But let's rotate this 180 degrees and look at the backside of the cube. And we'll zoom in a little bit. And then what you see is, look at this strip right here of either very strong blue or very strong red coloring. There's almost no green in that strip at all. So these all represent either very strong positive correlations or very strong anti-correlations. So what is it that's doing that? Well, if you look at the position of this strip here, it's the OH plane. It's oxygen and hydrogen plus any other element is producing all of these strong correlations and anti-correlations. So if, for example, just to give you a couple of examples, if I pull out the slice for Z equals lithium, and I look up here, oxygen and hydrogen, I see, we'll pull it out there to see it a little bit better. We see blue, which indicates anti-correlation. So in other words, lithium tends to not be associated with oxygen and hydrogen in minerals. The element right next door on the periodic table, beryllium, very chemically similar to lithium, strongly red. So strongly correlated with oxygen and hydrogen, tends to be found in hydrous minerals. That's really amazing. In every other way, the geochemistry of lithium and beryllium are very similar to each other. But here we see, from this data set, we see that they're behaving in a very opposite way in this one particular context. So you can go through the entire periodic table that way, and we've developed a new classification of so-called hydrophilic and hydrophobic elements according to how often they tend to be found in hydrous minerals. I should clarify that we don't mean in the molecular sense of repelling or attracting liquid water molecules. We mean their affinity for hydrous versus anhydrous mineral species. And what you notice is that things, again, like lithium and beryllium that are right next door on the periodic table, opposite behavior. Copper and nickel, very similar geochemical behavior otherwise, but very opposite behavior when it comes to being associated with water. So there are really interesting networks of effects here that I think, and I don't think it's by any means because copper loves water molecules and zinc doesn't. I'm sure it's more complicated than that. There are lots of geochemical factors going on. And so the way in which copper and zinc forms minerals tends to produce this differing behavior. And finally, I want to look at some other geochemical trends through time. I'd like to look at, for example, redox behavior is a very big one that we have been looking at lately, and I know one that many of you would be very interested in. Now, of course, looking at the evolution of minerals through time, just in a general sense, is not new at all. Geologists have been doing this for a long time. And for example, if you know any geochronologists, you know that they are a big fan of this mineral, zircon, which is a zirconium silicate. And zircon has the virtue of both being a very robust mineral that has formed throughout Earth's history, and it often contains a little bit of uranium, which means you can date it. You can do uranium lead dating on zircon. So we can look at different places in the Earth's crust and we can gather samples of zircon, and here's a bunch of zircon crystals right here, and we can plot up their ages and look at how often zircon formed through geologic time. And what you see is a very interesting trend. You see a histogram that tends to peak during periods where we have the formation of supercontinents. These are all the names of supercontinents. You'll probably recognize the most recent one there, Pangaea. But those were all periods in which Earth's tectonic plates got together and formed more or less one giant continent and one giant ocean. And when that happened, we tend to get a surge of production of these zircons, probably because material is slamming together, melting, generating new igneous rock, and we get new deposits of these crystals. Okay, so things like this have been done for a long time, and we can map out how zircons have changed through deep time. But one thing that we're particularly interested in, of course, is looking at how the Earth's overall redox behavior has changed through geologic time. Okay, we've seen a couple times now during the conference that famous graph of oxygen levels in the atmosphere, right? And it stays at 0 until about 2.5 billion years. We hit the great oxidation event. Then we get oxygen production in the atmosphere. And that surely has an effect on rock forming minerals and elements. Well, what I most wanted to do was pick one of these very abundant elements that is also redox sensitive. Okay, so for this purpose, we chose manganese, which is the 12th most abundant element in the Earth's crust. Okay, it sits in this green zone of fairly abundant rock forming minerals, but it also has the virtue of being very redox sensitive. Okay, so in normal Earth environments, it can take on actually 3 different oxidation states. And that's shown in this EH-PH diagram here that was actually prepared for me by Jiwa Hao, who I think many of you know, a great geochemist. So on this diagram, you can see here's aqueous Mn2, but then over here at higher pHs, you see a stratification of different mineral phases, even just manganese with oxygen, as simple as manganese oxides. You get several different mineral phases at different oxygen fugacities. So for example, down here at low oxygen fugacity, you get mainly Mn2, maybe a little bit of Mn3 in the form of this mineral. Mn2O3 is this beautiful purple mineral that happens to be called purpurite. I think it was named for that, but that's not fake, that's a real mineral name. And at the top there are things like pyrolusite, ramsdolite, okay, more oxidized minerals that contain Mn4. So we can look at that through time. We can look to see which types of minerals were forming at different periods in geologic history. And therefore, we automatically have an oxygen sensor. We have an oxygen sensor through deep time. Okay, so if we plot out, just like we did with the zircons, and we simply plot out the number of manganese mineral occurrences that we see through time, we notice, again, this effect that the zircons have. We notice this effect where it tends to spike during periods of supercontinent formation. Rodinia is a little bit weird. It spikes before and after, but not really much during. We think that there are weird geochemical effects going on there. And then in the GOE here, notice after the GOE, we start to get more and more occurrences of the +3 and +4 oxidation state. Okay, so there's this correlation with supercontinent formation, and then we also see this gradual change over time. And if we zoom in, especially on the most recent geologic time, the most recent 600, 700 million years or so, and we can plot out the average oxidation state, we take the weighted average of all the oxidation states of all the manganese in all the mineral species in all the localities all over the world, and we plot it out, and this is what we get. We actually see a systematic change. And we can plot that against oxygen levels, reconstructions of oxygen. And what we see are very, very similar trends. Okay, they're shifted a little bit in time, but actually if we take into account that time delay, we shifted over a little bit. Okay, notice I've simply added 66.5 million years there. Then all of a sudden things line up very, very well with each other. And we see that atmospheric oxygen and manganese minerals are following the same periodicity. And in fact, when you analyze this, when you fit it to a sinusoidal function, the manganese data gives you a periodicity of 35 million years. The oxygen data gives you 35.7 million years. Essentially the same within our threshold to detect. Okay, so that tells us that atmospheric oxygen is systematically changing manganese mineralogy all over the world, just as we suspected that it did. I also want to mention briefly a couple of projects that my graduate students are working on. This is Jessica Cruzan, who joined my lab just last year. She is trying to use these data sets to look specifically at iron silicate minerals, because of course, iron is another very important redox sensitive element. We see the same kinds of things. We see spikes during periods of supercontinent formation. And oddly, we don't see much redox change really in the iron silicates after the GOE, the Great Oxidation Event, which happens about right here. But again, during the Phanerozoic, during the most recent 600 million years, take a look at how much that red rapidly begins to dominate. Okay, Fe3+ becomes more and more and more prominent in minerals as we go through recent geologic time. Okay, so once again, we see the supercontinent correlation. We also see a recent redox effect. Okay, not at the GOE, but in recent times. I also have a graduate student, Catherine Urinek, who has been doing both copper proteins and copper minerals. So okay, I'm about out of time here, so I'll wrap this up quickly. But basically, she has taken a database of 771 copper bearing minerals with all of its chemistry, all of its oxidation states. And she's trying to combine that with 94 copper group IDs from the protein data bank. Okay, so copper bearing proteins that we just heard some about. And here are some examples of those. She has data on all of these various copper bearing proteins. And what she's trying to do is input the gene sequences that make these proteins, put them into BLAST, figure out what organisms they come from, and trace back in geologic time a phylogenetic tree essentially of how these different copper bearing proteins originated. Okay, so I would be really thrilled to talk to some of you about how we can best construct these timelines with these copper bearing proteins, because we want, again, to correlate this with what is going on with copper geochemistry. Okay, so, for example, here are 3 totally different classes of copper bearing protein, class 1, class 2, class 3. Did these classes of copper centers evolve from different geochemical environments? I'm willing to bet that they did. And I'm willing to bet that we can now correlate that with events in the geochemical past. Okay, so to wrap up, number 1, our understanding of geochemical conditions on Earth and the minerals that they produce, I think is extremely important for informing our knowledge of what biomolecules are likely possible at different points in time on the Earth. And 2, I hope I've convinced you that we now have the data resources and analytical tools to identify these global patterns in geochemistry, trace them through time, and start correlating them with other things. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I look forward to discussing it with all of you in the future.